Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Coffee Shop Philosophy. As always, I'm your host, Killian Hobbs, former journalism director at think-liberty.com. As many of you may have seen, there's been a recent change and shuffle that's happened where Think Liberty, the Rational Standard out of South Africa, and Being Libertarian have all undergone a merger to become one singular entity for liberty. As such, as part of this merger, I'm now the managing editor for Think Liberty, as well as the news editor for all three publications. So that's a little bit of a mouthful. I'll come up with a different way to introduce myself going forward. You can still listen to our podcasts wherever you listen to Think Liberty podcasts. You can still follow Think Liberty, Being Libertarian, or Rational Standard on any of the social media feeds. And if you don't see us there, you can reach out to us to see if we can get onto that platform for you. And you can follow our websites at think-liberty.com, beinglibertarian.com, and therationalstandard.com. Now, to hop back into the episode itself. On today's episode, what I wanted to cover was argumentation itself. Now, when we're talking about argumentation and debate, most people frame this in the sense of political or philosophical or something that has more weight to it in that sense. What people forget, though, is that good debate or good argumentation has a lot to do with regular, everyday conversations. The conversations that you might have with someone at a bar, the conversations you might have at work, the conversations you might have with friends and family about small, minor things that have nothing to do with politics or religion or economics or anything as grandiose as that. However, we can take the same lessons that we learn from these areas and bring it into our everyday lives. Now, for this particular aspect of argumentation, the part that I want to focus on today is the classification of problems and implementing the classification of problems. So, first I need to describe what I mean by classification of problems. When I refer to that, what I mean is sometimes you'll be debating something, and what you're debating isn't necessarily the real problem at hand. It is a subset of a larger problem or a more core problem. And if you're dealing exclusively in this subset argument, you're never going to get any leeway with the person you're talking to, and the person you're talking to isn't going to get any leeway with you. I'll use a pretty popular example to break down what I'm talking about here and kind of give you the example of what I mean, and then we can work through how to classify where a problem is, and then classify how to implement this system of argumentation and this system of classification in your everyday arguments. So to start, I'm going to use an example that's pretty popular in libertarian circles, especially when you're talking to non-libertarians, which is the gun control debate. Now, you can be talking to someone about gun control, and it could be something as simple as, they take the hard progressive stance of, we don't need guns, we need to ban guns, there's been a mass shooting, how many people need to die, et cetera, and that could be the argument against guns. Then you might be more on the right-hand side of that argument, where you say, well, no, it's a right, it's something that we need to stand for. The empirical aspect of it doesn't matter when we're talking about rights. We can come up with different solutions rather than impeding the rights of a person. And that might be the argument that you're working off of. Your opponent could be working against gun control, or working for, I should say, gun control itself, working against the idea of free gun ownership. Now, this is what I would consider an E-class problem. Now, as you may gather quickly by hearing me call it an E-class problem, that means that there's 4 problems ahead of this one, or 4 higher tier arguments that we can go to. So in this case, if we're talking about gun control specifically, we're not really discussing gun control. What we're discussing is what makes it valid to impede a right. That's the D-class problem. We're not going to answer the gun control question until we can answer if and when it is right to impede the rights of another person. What needs to take place? What is a situation, or what is the parameters to make it worth invalidating the rights of someone or impeding the rights of someone if there is a situation when it's worth impeding the rights of somebody. So that would be the D class problem. We cannot solve the E class without solving the D class. Even if we do it just through that E class problem, we still need to solve the D class problem to have any real resolution in the E class debate. But again, that's the D class. There's higher levels here. If we go up a level from there and we say, okay, well, we're going back and forth on when can we impede a right? Well, we need to ask ourselves what rights are at that point. Are they something that's completely solid, cannot be infringed, cannot be changed? Are they just something that you have no matter what? Or are they something more malleable? Are they something more open to these types of changes? Something that there is grounds where what your rights are can change, in which case that's the C class problem. If we take it up a step further, we can answer that by answering the B class problem, which is, where are these rights coming from? Because if we know where the rights are coming from, then there's going to be stipulations that go along with it. I mean, if you take the God-given rights example, then these are rights that you have from God, which means that no person can impede them. The answer for the C, the D, and the E class problem are answered at that point. If it's a legality thing and you take the constitutional approach, then it says right in the Constitution, shall not be infringed, in which case we've answered the C, the D, and the E class problem. If you take natural rights or Hayek's social evolutionary theory of rights or something more into those veins of the philosophy of the concept of rights, then it gets a little bit more malleable and we have more room for debate on how the rest of the chain is going to go. So to recap so far, the E-class problem was gun control. The D-class problem was whether rights were malleable. The C-class problem was what a right actually is, if it's malleable at all. The B-class problem is where these rights come from. And then we get to the A-class problem. And this is where you really want to have your debate. This is the core area that's going to define how well the debate goes for the rest of the topics that are underneath. In this particular case, I would say that the A-class debate is whether or not rights exist at all. So we can have the concept of rights and we can have this idea of rights, but if they're just ideas and they're just concepts, then they're not something that has any tangibility to them. They're not something that has any meaning to them unless we can say and argue that these rights have meaning. These rights have value. There is an importance to having rights. If you take the conversation up to the A-class problem from the person that you were on the bitter opposite end of the spectrum when it came to the gun control aspect, you'll probably find you agree on the A-class problem. You agree that rights are a thing and rights should exist. You've reached a point of agreement on the A-class problem, in which case, once you've answered the A-class problem, then you're both working off of the same footing when you go down to the B-class problem. And then you can work from your agreements on the previous step saying, rights are a thing. This is not something that we can say doesn't exist. We've agreed that rights are a thing, or we've agreed that rights aren't actually a thing. It's just some nebulous concept we have. Whatever the result of that A-class debate is between you. We can then go to the B-class problem, agreeing on that primary point. When we agree on that primary point, we can use that to shift into the B-class, which makes it easier for us to reach resolution on the B-class problem. We can then take that to the C-class, and then the D-class, and then finally the E-class, which was our original debate. So in this situation, the explanation that I've given here, it is a waste of time to try to have that debate in an E-class argument. It is 4 steps away from the truth, 4 steps away from the core argument or core debate that you need to be having where you're actually going to make up ground. If you can't answer and come to some form of conclusion on the D, the C, the B, and the A-class problem with your opponent, then you're never going to come to any fruitful agreement on the E-class problem. They might end up agreeing with your argument or not being able to counter it, but it's not going to change the line of thinking that led to them agreeing to it. And it may just take a slight nudge or hearing a slight argument that reinforces their previous statements to put them right back on the other side. It means that what comes out of the debate, even if you get a short-term agreement, it's not going to really change their mind long-term. It's not something that's going to have the lasting impact on what they believe, the way they think, the way they act, or what's going to come out of that argument. Basically turning the entire back and forth into an exchange of hot breath, a waste of air at that point. Now, I'll give you a life example to help you classify these sort of problems. Let's say, you have a at-home situation. It's something as simple as arguing over who's going to pick up the kids. Maybe first time the kids are starting to go to school, or it's getting to that point where the kids are starting to get old enough to go to school. And at that point, you have to start arguing over, who's going to go pick up the kids when school time's over, who has the time to go do that, or who's going to be the one to go do that. Well, again, that's one of those lower class problems. You can go back up a step and say, okay, well, we don't need to ask who's going to take care of that process. We need to ask whose daytime schedule fits it. In which case we can say, okay, well, person A's daytime schedule does not fit being back in town in time to pick up the kids. Person B's schedule does fit, so they should. Or if person B's schedule does not fit, then we have to go up another step and say, okay, what's going to be the route that we can use to solve this? What's going to be the approach here? The next problem up, we can say, okay, it's not a matter of who's going to do it. It's not a matter of who can do it, because we know that neither can do it. It's a matter of what do we do since no one can do it? Because it's not a matter at that point of answering who can pick up the kids. It's a question of what do we do if we cannot? Or is there an option for not picking up the kids at all? That'd be the higher class problem. Because if there's an option for not picking up the kids at all, then that's the approach you have to take, in which case you get the latchkey kids moments where they just know to go home and stay home until their parents arrive. And sometimes that's the option you have to take. But if you try to have the argument of one person has to leave work early versus the other person leaving work early in order to make sure the kids get picked up, then that's just going to be an aimless back and forth since, well, neither one of you are going to want to leave work early constantly in order to do that. It's going to damage your careers. You're going to lose the money from it, so on and so forth. But again, the higher tier options exist. You can take the conversation up a level. Now, in my original example, we started with the low tier concept, and then we worked our way up. In this case, it was still a lower tier argument or a lower tier debate, but we had to start at the low tier question in order to work our way up. So in the first example, we could have skipped everything at the bottom and jumped directly to the top to begin with. We could have started off with the concept of rights existing at all and worked our way down and gotten our answer there. In the real life example, or at least the more commonplace example, so less philosophy, less politics, less general debate and argumentation, and more real life example, we needed to start at the bottom in order to work our way back up. So when we're trying to classify these problems, the first question we need to ask isn't what our opponent's stance is or where they're coming from or anything like that. We need to ask, okay, this is the current problem or the current topic that we're debating. Is there a higher level to this? Is there more to this concept than we're thinking of? Is there more depth that we can find in this line of thinking that can help us get a resolution without having to worry about just debating back and forth, since that's obviously going nowhere? So in the case of the picking up the kids, we know, okay, we can think about picking up the kids, but let's try to classify this. Let's try to think about this. And if you put those goggles on, you'll say, okay, we're looking at the kids, but we know that this is a time constraint issue, in which case, okay, the next step up, is there other options? Well, yes, there is. We can go the latchkey option. Present that option, problem solved. If that option does not work, then you have to go back to, okay, if that option's off the table, then that means we do need to decide what's here. So the next option up is, okay, who can afford to take the time off? Well, neither person can. Okay, then we need to go back down and try to figure something out here. We can go through a process of elimination by asking questions outside of the argument that we're working on. And by taking that little step of separation, by branching it away from the core argument that you're having, then that means you can ask questions that aren't going to put people's backs up the same way. They're not going to set off the same alarms in the other person's head that they're in a debate or they're in an argument with somebody, which means from an actual accomplishment perspective, you're going to be far more likely to reach something that looks like a resolution than you would if you just continued arguing in that E-class problem space. And we see this with just about every topic that you could debate. Name a topic that you get into a heated argument with someone about, and I'm sure you can find that there's higher tiers to that argument that you could go to, and you'd have far more luck coming to some sort of resolution on it. Even if the end result is that you're the person that's in the wrong, there's still those higher tiers to those arguments that if you take it to that place, you can keep it in an actual argumentative zone, rather than just sheer contrarianism where both sides are just picking the red versus blue approach where they're on opposite sides and they're going to stay on opposite sides, similar to the type of people I described in my dogmatism episode last week. Rather than letting people get into that state where they dig the trench and they make sure they stay in there and they're not going to budge, move the conversation out of that into those higher planes, into those more direct areas. So you're not dealing with just this problem that's sitting here in front of you. You're dealing with the actual roots of it. You're not chopping the heads off of dandelions. You're actually pulling out the roots to make sure the weed doesn't continue growing. That's one of the biggest aspects of argumentation that we lose because we end up confining ourselves to the debate at hand. We don't want to be seen as moving the goalpost or be seen as taking the argument off track, when in reality we have to. If we want to see something that resembles an accomplishment, if we want to see something that resembles resolution to these debates that we're trying to have, then we need to look for those higher tier arguments. So as I mentioned when we started the episode, I was going to explain how to look for these types of arguments, what they are, everything else. I've covered what they are, both a more political example as well as a more real life example. But if we're looking at how to identify it, it's a very simplistic process. You don't have to label and name every step along the way. You just have to recognize, okay, this is what I'm getting into the argument with this person with. Let me step back. This is the topic. Is this topic the cause of a different topic? That's the only question you have to ask yourself. Is this topic of debate or this argument coming out of a different debate? Is it coming out of a different argument, a different place that's causing this conflict or this confrontation? If it's coming from a different place, then you don't need to be wasting your time where you are. You need to take the conversation to that place. If you can answer things in that place or the place above it or the place above it, then you're more likely to actually find resolution the whole way down. Quite often, we might find ourselves on polar opposites of one particular area, but as we take the argument up the chain, you'll find that the actual difference of opinion between most people is very slim. It's a very slim difference between people, because if they're passionate about whatever topic they're arguing about, then chances are they want the same kind of result. They want a positive outcome. They want to see a certain answer that's going to solve a problem. Going back to the gun control option, people that argue for gun control generally aren't arguing for gun control out of just some inherent personal hatred of firearms. That's not the case 9 times out of 10. There are some people that are just against the existence of them, and somehow think that the best option is that the police should be the only ones that hold them while also being against police brutality. But again, I covered that cognitive dissonance on my last episode. But when it comes to this idea of argumentation and this idea of problem classification, we need to look at where they're coming from with this and why, so that we can identify that next step up. So in this case, we know that they're not arguing just against guns in general. They're arguing against the deaths of children, or the deaths of people in movie theaters or at the mall, or the concept of mass murder itself. That's the position that they're taking. So in this E-class problem, we know that that's what they're debating against. That's what their problem is. So when we take it up that next step and we go up that higher level, we can keep that in mind and say, okay, neither one of us want to see mass shootings. However, we both believe that maybe rights are inherent. We can go up to that top concept and say that rights are important and exist as one of the available stances that one could take. We could say that rights properly exist. Okay. We agreed on A, we agreed on B, we agreed on C. The divide is coming up because we both have different pragmatic approaches as to how to reduce the amount of deaths from mass shootings. Because you can agree on, let's go through the gun chain again, for example. If we go all the way up to the A-class problem, you can agree that rights exist. Next step down, you could agree that rights come from the legal perspective. Let's say the Constitution. There's a lot of people that argue the constitutional argument. So let's say it comes from, Second Amendment. That's where the right in question comes from. It comes from that document. Thus, the treatment of it, the existence of it, the malleability of it will be laid out and defined by that document, in which case that document says shall not be infringed. So you might agree on A, B, C, and D, but it's not going to answer their concerns that's in that E-class problem. Because you could agree at the end of the day that, yes, okay, it says Second Amendment shall not be infringed, so that's not what we can do, but we have to do something. We have to find a way to fix this. Okay, great. In this case, you can go into what I consider subclass arguments. So we've already covered the idea of higher class arguments, where we go up entire tiers of argument to get more to a root cause. But sometimes we can also go into sub-arguments that are necessary based on why we're arguing it at all. We may not be arguing just because we disagree. We may be arguing because of other factors outside of the debate itself that are driving our opinions, in which case we need to resolve those as well if we want to see a form of resolution. So in this case, the person's arguing not against the guns themselves, or not necessarily for extra government for the sake of extra government. They're arguing simply from an emotional perspective of too many people die from gun violence. We need to find a way to fix this issue. This is the solution that's been given. This is the solution I support because no one else is supporting anything else. You can have that subsection debate then and say, well, here's a couple of other options that we can work with. We could work with, and I'm sure there's a lot of minarchists and anarchists listening to this that are going to be against this idea, or at least the state-funded version. They might support a voluntary version of this, but instead of spending all that time and energy trying to repeal the Second Amendment or trying to impede gun ownership rights, flip it instead into public awareness and education. Make that the focus so people have an understanding of these. Make it similar to what happened with the MAD program, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, to the point where friends and family stop friends and family from getting behind the wheel when they're drunk. They'll physically stop them. They'll take the keys and make sure that that just does not happen. Because we had a cultural shift that makes it so that people kept an eye on each other when it came to the use of alcohol and operating a motor vehicle. We can have the same thing when it comes to guns and gun ownership, where if you see someone and they look like they're getting a little wonky and they're looking to have some, they're looking to draw some blood, then have it where people talk to each other a bit more. In fact, that would probably do wonders for mental health, just the fact that people are paying attention to each other and caring about the mental states of other people. Even if they're only caring about it from the perspective of, I really hope this guy doesn't snap in 2 days and shoot us all. Just by changing the conversation into that type of onus, that type of ownership of the responsibility, and saying, well, maybe it shouldn't be the state option. Maybe there shouldn't be an infringement to the rights that we both agreed come from this document that says it shall not be infringed. Maybe instead, what we need to do is focus on mental health amongst people and making sure that people are watching each other, not in a big brother supervisory way, but more of a neighborhood taking care of each other. If you see someone that seems distressed or seems like they might be having some kind of problems and might violently lash out, reach out to them, talk to them, bridge the gap, try to help them, try to get them to seek help so that they don't take such an extreme step. You're not going to completely get rid of it, but neither is the state option. You're not going to completely solve the problem, but you can find a more voluntary way to do it. You can find a more community-focused way. You can find options other than impeding the rights that we've seen in the higher classifications of argument that both parties had agreed should not be violated. So, taking it back to personal examples, sometimes when you're arguing with someone, you might get caught up in the argument itself. You might bog yourself down and get into that trench and not want to leave, but the only way out of that trench is to see where your opponent has trenched themselves in and to find out why. If you can classify and figure out why the person you're dealing with has put themselves inside of this little box and they refuse to leave, then you can have those subsection debates. You can move the conversation into more of a, where is this argument coming from perspective. You still want to use the better classifications to get to the root cause, but sometimes the root debate and the root cause can be different. So I would say that the root debate is the higher classification of argument, whereas the root cause are the subsections of those debates. Now, with all of that said, and it might be a little tricky to try to visualize that in a conversation, so I'll package this in some pretty simple things to consider when you're in a debate or an argument with someone. The first question you want to ask is this debate the result of something else? Is this argument coming out because something different is unresolved? That if that other thing was resolved, this by proxy would be resolved. This down the chain wouldn't even be a debate because the previous debate would have solved it. Is there something higher to that? Ask that question whenever you get into a debate with anything. Because if there is that higher item that could solve this problem, then go for that. Try to move your opponent into that conversation and say, okay, this is what we're debating right now, but can we come to an agreement on this? Because if we can, then that debate doesn't matter. So let's focus here and see if we disagree. And if you disagree there, ask again, okay, is there something that causes that? Is there something that causes that? Ask that question ad infinitum until you get to the root cause. But while you're discussing this with your opponent, do not neglect where they're coming from. Again, for the classifications problems itself, it's not the most important thing, but realistically, I can't not stress the importance of those subsets, the importance of where your opponent is coming from, because they can be a deciding factor in whether or not you win that debate. Just because you take it to a higher tier does not necessarily mean you're going to be the one that wins. It just means that you're going to have a more productive conversation, which definitely 100% is important. But a part of it as well is trying to win the debate and trying to nail down the causes that are involved. And again, even if you do that, you could still be the person that's wrong here. But it's important to start off with asking, okay, where is this coming from? Where is my opponent getting to this point? Are they there out of sheer logic? Are they there from a more emotional response? Are they there simply because they're personally involved in it and they want it to work out a certain way because that's easier for them. Whatever the real reason is for that, that's going to be your subsetting reasons. And that's going to follow through all the way up the classification chain and all the way down. So the last note I can really say with this particular topic and the ways that you can implement it and use it in your life is to say, when you're talking to your opponent, always try to find an area that you can work from. If you can find that core area that you can work from, and if you can find questions and routes for the debate to go that can actually solve everything down the chain, go there. If you can find and you actively look for why your opponent is taking the stances they take, not just assuming, but looking for actual parts of their conversation, looking for body language, looking for things you know about them, because chances are the person you're debating, if it's not on the internet, is a real person in real life that you actually know. Find out where they're coming from with that and apply that to the classification system I laid out throughout the rest of this podcast. If you can do those two things, I find you won't have any more debates that are truly frustrating anymore. And you'll actually have far better results out of your debates with people than you would if you simply stay in that E-class space. Now, as always, just before I wrap up the podcast here, I just want to make a mention, of course, that as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, we are in a partnership now, or a merger, I should say, with Being Libertarian as well as The Rational Standard. So do make sure to check out those two publications on the internet there. Do make sure to follow all three of us on the various social media feeds. I'm not listing the specific 6 for Think Liberty and the specific ones for Being Libertarian and the specific ones for Rational Standard. That would mean half the episode turns into plugs, and I'm not going to do that in this episode or forward. So I am going to loop back to saying most social media feeds. I'm just going to do that. It's easier for me. You can always, again, follow our websites, follow our social media feeds, listen to our podcasts wherever you get your podcasts. There are podcasts available from Rational Standard as well as from Being Libertarian that you can find on YouTube or different RSS feeds. Again, just go look for them, search the name of the sites, and you'll find us. You can go to the various shops. There's tons of great swag to pick up there at pretty decent prices. And as always, if you liked what you heard and you'd like to hear more, I'll see you again next week.